6,000 North Vietnamese Army troops. According to General Westmoreland, the Americans killed more than 1,200 in a storm of heavy fire. American commanders were buoyed up by their apparent success on the battlefield. More such victories would quickly force the Viet Cong to give up their campaign. The optimism did not last long. By the close of 1965, the Americans were finding it impossible to make the Viet Cong fight pitched battles. Meantime, U.S. casualties were rising fast from ambushes, booby traps, and surprise attacks. By the start of 1966, Military Assistance Command, known as MACV, the main American headquarters in South Vietnam, deployed 184,000 U.S. troops. Army units were concentrated in the Saigon area, in a strip along the Central Coast, and in the Central Highlands. The Marines of the 3rd Marine Amphibious Force were further north, in the area known as I Corps. I Corps bordered the demilitarized zone separating North and South Vietnam. The Marines now had 3 main bases in I Corps, at Da Nang, Chu Lai, and Phu Bai, while the South Vietnamese Army had headquarters at Hue and Quang Nai. The threat came from NLF battalions in the countryside and the border areas, the North Vietnamese Army on the demilitarized zone, and from tens of thousands of local NLF inside the heavily populated coastal belt. To the NLF, the coastal villages were a priceless asset. They produced vast quantities of rice which could feed the big guerrilla units in the remote interior. They also produced large numbers of recruits. Over the years, the NLF had gained control of thousands of villages. They had created their own local administration and village guerrilla forces. The villages also played host to the big units as they passed through on operations. All the areas in which the American Marines had built their bases were surrounded by NLF-controlled villages. Marine sweeps through the settlements rarely managed to find them. Viet Cong tactics were to pull out the main guerrilla forces and officials, leaving only snipers and booby traps behind. After the Marines had moved on, the fighters would quickly return. For the Americans, it was deeply frustrating. The Marines were forced to think again about how they could fight this new and unsettling kind of war. The answer the Marines came up with was a pacification program. The idea was to fight the NLF for control of the villages and to do it around the clock. Squad and company-sized units patrolled vigorously and mounted constant ambushes. The rice harvest was protected to keep it out of Viet Cong hands. In areas that stayed hostile, whole villages were moved by force to districts already pacified. The Marines' aggressive military tactics were combined with persuasion. In civic action projects, widely known as the Hearts and Minds program, villagers were given medical aid and help with economic development. The Marines claimed the policy was highly successful and helped bring more than 1 million people under government control. However, in reality, it was just an illusion, and the NLF still managed to infiltrate these areas, which continued to abound with sympathizers. The change came in mid-1966. General Westmoreland, the commander of U.S. forces in South Vietnam, had never agreed with the Marines' methods. He believed that controlling villages was a waste of highly trained and heavily armed troops. Westmoreland argued that the Marines should instead be used to pursue the enemy's big units in the remote interior. In fact, events would soon force the Marines to reduce their whole pacification effort. Civil unrest erupted between South Vietnamese factions right across the country. The North saw its opportunity and assembled thousands of troops poised to cross into the South. It was a threat the Marines could not ignore. The North Vietnamese Army's 324B Division crossed the demilitarized zone in late May 1966 and encountered a Marine battalion. The NVA held their ground, and the largest battle of the war to date broke out near Dong Ha. General Walt moved most of the 3rd Marine Division north, 5,000 men in 5 battalions. In Operation Hastings, the Marines, backed by South Vietnamese Army troops, the heavy guns of U.S. warships, and the Marines' own artillery and air power, drove the NVA back over the demilitarized zone in just over 3 weeks. Because the Marines were forbidden to cross the demilitarized zone into North Vietnam, the 324B Division, along with elements of 2 more divisions, were able to regroup and return to the south almost at once. The Marines were forced to mount Operation Prairie, which tied up 11 battalions, nearly 10,000 troops, for a full 10 months. To support the operations, they and Special Forces units built a string of combat bases stretching from Jiolin in the east to Khe Sanh in the west. Casualties on both sides were heavy in Operations Hastings and Prairie. Although over 300 Americans were dead and nearly 1,500 wounded, it was a victory for the Americans. However, the NVA divisions had not been beaten. They simply slipped back across the demilitarized zone from where they could return at any time. The Marines now had little choice but to keep strong forces in the area. As the Americans had expected, in the first months of 1967, North Vietnamese Army units once more began infiltrating into the south. The Marine reaction was to mount big operations to find them and cut them off. Both sides were determined to control the hilltops dominating the valley trails. The bloodiest battles of all were those fought for the hills surrounding the Marine combat base at Khe Sanh. These were 881 North and South and Hill 861, thus named for their height in feet. American bases below the demilitarized zone were strung out along Route 1 and Route 9. The command center was Dong Ha, while Camp Carroll and the Rock Pile were artillery bases with long-range heavy guns. On the western end of Route 9, Long Vei, a special forces camp, and the Marine base at Khe Sanh were particularly important. They dominated North Vietnamese infiltration routes into the south from the demilitarized zone and from Laos. Khe Sanh Combat Base sat astride the valley of the Rao Quan River, with Dong Tri Mountain to the north and a series of smaller, numbered hills to the northwest. In April 1967, elements of the NVA 325C Division moved onto Hills 881 North and South and Hill 861 and stormed a signal relay station atop Hill 950. They built fortifications and placed artillery to support the main effort. An infantry assault by all three of the division's regiments, more than 5,000 men. The base at Khe Sanh had been defended by only a single company of Marines. But now, American strength was raised to 2 battalions with more artillery. By May 5th, after violent battles, the Marines had seized all 3 key hills. The battered North Vietnamese division pulled back over the demilitarized zone and across the Laotian border. After the hill fights at Khe Sanh, the war on the demilitarized zone shifted to the eastern sector. North Vietnamese artillery, hidden inside the zone, hammered Marine bases, causing heavy casualties. 30,000 NVA troops tried to infiltrate past the American outposts. In July 1967, there was heavy fighting near Con Thien, killing 1,300 NVA troops. During the last months of 1967, the Marines launched one operation after another to try and intercept infiltrating NVA forces. It was no easy task. The terrain was rough. There were never enough helicopters, and poor weather often shut down air operations. Meanwhile, powerful NVA units were once again massing in the hills and forests around the Quezon combat base.